I used to enjoy the solitude of my apartment. No one to answer to, no interruptions, just the quiet hum of a familiar routine. One chilly autumn evening, with the wind rattling the windows and the city lights dim by an early dusk, I found myself alone at home as usual. That night, however, everything began to change. It started subtly. I noticed that the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder than usual, as if it were echoing in a suddenly cavernous room. I dismissed it at first. Maybe it was just the quiet settling of the building, but then I began to hear faint sounds that I couldn't explain. It was a soft creak, like footsteps on the hardwood floor, coming from somewhere deep within the apartment. I convinced myself it was my imagination, the result of too many late nights and too little sleep. After dinner, I sat on the couch watching television, trying to distract myself from the eerie feeling that had started to build. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the TV screen went black for a moment. My heart skipped a beat. I reached for the remote, but when the screen returned to life, I noticed that one of the pictures hanging on the wall had shifted slightly. Its frame was now askew, though I was certain I had hung it perfectly earlier that day. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the light vibrations had nudged it. But the unease grew. Later, as I prepared for bed, I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. I locked the door behind me, even though I lived on the second floor, and then climbed the stairs to my small bedroom. Once there, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching. Lying in bed, I heard it, a soft, deliberate scraping at the edge of the room. I lay frozen, straining to listen. The sound moved slowly, almost methodically, as if something was being dragged along the floor. I reached for my phone to check the time, my hands trembling. It was just after 2 a.m. The scraping paused, replaced by a deep, almost imperceptible breath right outside my door. My skin crawled. I gathered my courage and turned on the overhead light, then crept to the door. I pressed my ear against the cool wood and listened, but there was nothing. Just silence and the steady beat of my own heart. I convinced myself that it must have been a stray animal or perhaps a trick of the house settling in the night. That night, sleep was elusive. I dozed fitfully, waking at intervals to check the door. In the morning, everything seemed normal, yet I couldn't forget the oppressive feeling of being observed. Over the next few nights, the disturbances became more pronounced. Objects in my apartment were slightly out of place. A mug moved from the kitchen table to the counter, a book left open on my desk. I installed a small security camera in my living room, hoping to capture any explanation. The footage was grainy and unsettling. For a few seconds, a dark shape seemed to appear in the background, hovering just beyond the frame, then vanishing when I rewound the tape. Finally, one night, as I sat alone watching the feed on my laptop, I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint reflection in the window behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to find someone there, but the room was empty. The only evidence was the lingering image of a pair of eyes, dark and unblinking, that seemed to dissolve into the shadows. I eventually decided I couldn't live like that any longer. I packed my belongings and moved out of that apartment the following week. I later learned that the building had a history of break-ins, of unwelcome visitors who'd been reported by previous tenants. Perhaps I was just imagining things, but I can't shake the memory of that night, the soft scraping, the strange shifts in my surroundings, and that final glimpse of eyes in the dark. Now when I'm alone, I sometimes catch a flicker of movement in a window or hear a sound that I can't explain. And though I've moved on, I know that the horrors of that night will follow me. A reminder that sometimes being alone is not as peaceful as it seems. I was home alone on a stormy Friday night. The wind howled outside my apartment, and the rain battered the windows, making the entire building tremble. I had expected a quiet evening, some music, a book, maybe a movie. Instead, from the moment I stepped in, something felt off. The hallway light flickered, throwing strange shadows on the walls. I noticed the living room door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd closed it. My heart pounded as I pushed it shut, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. In the silence that followed, I heard a soft creak from deeper within the apartment, a sound that didn't match the wind outside. I told myself it was only the building settling. But then came another noise, a deliberate tapping on the kitchen window, as if someone were tapping from the other side of the glass. I approached the window with trembling hands. The tapping stopped the moment I reached it. Outside, there was nothing but the dark, rain-soaked street. The silence that followed felt suffocating. To distract myself, I turned on the TV in the living room. The screen filled with harsh static, and every so often I thought I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I tried to dismiss it, blaming fatigue and an overactive mind. But as the night wore on, the disturbances grew. Small things started to change on their own. A mug shifted from its usual spot, a book left open on the coffee table. Each time I looked away, something in the room altered ever so slightly, as if someone had been there, watching, waiting. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were soft, unmistakably human, and paused right outside my bedroom door. I lay frozen, heart hammering, too scared to move. The footsteps eventually receded, leaving me shivering in the dark. The next morning, I found a note on my kitchen counter, written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting. It read simply, "I was here." No signature, no explanation, just a chilling reminder that I wasn't alone. I reported the incident to the police, but with no evidence beyond a note and my own mounting terror, they dismissed it as stress-induced paranoia. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, every time I'm home alone, I listen intently for any creaks or taps in the dead of night, haunted by the thought that the quiet might be hiding a dark presence that could return at any moment. I always took solace in the quiet of my apartment, an escape from the constant hum of city life. Being home alone was a source of peace, a chance to unwind with a book or a movie. But one cold November night, that peace shattered into something I can't forget. I had planned a quiet evening, order takeout, curl up on the couch, maybe listen to some music. The wind was howling outside and a fierce storm rattled the windows, turning the familiar into something eerie. I settled into my favorite armchair with the lights low, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass. For a while, everything was normal. Then around 11:45 p.m., I heard a faint sound, a soft creak coming from the hallway. I paused, listening. It sounded too deliberate to be the wind. I told myself it was just the old building settling. After all, the apartment was nearly 100 years old. I resumed my evening, though an uneasy feeling had begun to nest in my chest. A short time later, while I was lost in a book, the power flickered. The lights dimmed briefly before coming back on. In that split second of darkness, I thought I saw something move at the end of the hall, a quick shadow that vanished when the lights returned. I tried to dismiss it, blaming my tired eyes in the storm. Around midnight, I decided to check the front door. I always locked it, sometimes twice. But that night, as I walked to the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I froze. I was certain I had locked it earlier. My heart pounded as I gently pushed it closed, glancing over my shoulder as if expecting to see someone lurking. But the corridor was empty, only the echo of the rain and my own ragged breathing. Later, as I sat back on the couch trying to focus on the movie, a series of small changes began to disturb the space around me. A cushion had been moved from its usual spot. A framed photograph on the wall was tilted at an odd angle. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the shadows in the flickering light. Yet a nagging sense of violation settled over me. Then came the sound that would forever haunt that night. Just after 2 a.m., as I was drifting between sleep and wakefulness, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Not the rushed, erratic sounds of someone fleeing, but measured steps, steady and deliberate. I lay frozen under my blanket, my heart drumming in my ears. The footsteps paused right outside my bedroom door. For what felt like an eternity, I heard nothing but the pounding of my pulse, and then they began moving again, slowly receding down the hall. I couldn't sleep after that. In the pale light of dawn, I mustered the courage to investigate. I checked every door and window. Everything was secure. But on my kitchen counter, I discovered a single, dirty fingerprint in the condensation. A stark, inexplicable smear that seemed to press into the surface as if someone had been there, watching. My stomach churned and every instinct urged me to leave. I reported the incident to the building's management, but they dismissed it as a faulty lock and my overactive imagination. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone, that something had been in my home when I wasn't looking. I began reviewing the few security camera clips from the corridor. For a few moments, a shadow seemed to flicker in the distance, a dark figure standing in the half-light of the hallway. But whenever I tried to zoom in, it disappeared. In the following weeks, the memory of that night refused to fade. Every time I sat alone in a quiet room, I could almost hear those deliberate footsteps, feel that cold, uninvited presence lingering just beyond the light. Even as I moved to a new apartment, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving in a reflection or a door left ajar, and I would shudder remembering that dreadful night. I still don't know what happened that stormy night. I've come to believe that sometimes the most terrifying horrors are not born of monsters or the supernatural, but from the creeping realization that the familiar can turn hostile when you're truly alone. And no matter how many times I try to convince myself that it was just an overactive imagination, I can't help but wonder if someone, ever really did enter my home when I was not looking.